Most people remember Mustafa Kemal Atatürk as the father of modern Turkey, the man whose portrait still watches over classrooms, state buildings, and public memory. He survives in history as the founder, the reformer, the soldier who turned defeat into a republic. But that is the finished image, not the beginning. Long before the republic, the secular laws, the Latin alphabet, and the carefully shaped mythology of national rebirth, he was a boy in Salonika, born in 1881 into an Ottoman world already under strain. Salonika was not a sleepy provincial town. It was a borderland city of commerce, ethnic mixture, imperial administration, and political tension, a place where Europe and the Ottoman Empire pressed against each other in daily life. That setting mattered, because Mustafa Kemal did not grow up inside a confident empire. He grew up inside one that still looked large on the map, but was losing authority, coherence, and prestige. His father, Ali Rıza Efendi, died when Mustafa was still young, and his mother Zübeyde Hanım became a decisive influence in a life already marked by discipline and loss. He attended military schools, and at one of them a teacher gave him the name Kemal, often translated as perfection or maturity, a detail that later feels almost too symbolic because the military path did more than educate him. It gave him structure inside a decaying political order. By then, the lesson was already taking hold. If the empire was weak, then survival would not come from sentiment toward the old order. It would come from method, command, and clarity. What changed everything was that Mustafa Kemal did not merely witness Ottoman decline. He absorbed it as a personal problem. He was not content to be a loyal officer in a state drifting toward irrelevance. He wanted to understand why it was failing, and eventually he would conclude that saving the people under Ottoman rule no longer meant saving the empire itself. That is what makes his early life so powerful in narrative terms. Before he became Atatürk, he was a young man watching the political shell around him crack and learning that in moments of collapse, the future belongs not to those who cling hardest to dying structures, but to those willing to create new ones before everyone else accepts the old world is gone. The central question in his rise is not how he became famous. It is how one military student in a dying empire came to believe he could bury that empire and build a nation in its place. The military made Mustafa Kemal, but it also radicalized his sense of what the empire lacked. He studied at military schools in Salonika, then Monastir, then Istanbul, absorbing not just tactics and discipline, but the atmosphere of late Ottoman anxiety. The empire was still sovereign, yet defeat and humiliation kept returning. Reform was discussed endlessly, but weakness remained. In that world, the officer corps became more than a professional class. It became one of the few places where ambitious young men could imagine rescuing the state through intelligence, organization, and force. Mustafa Kemal graduated from the Ottoman Military Academy and entered service as an officer, but the army he joined was not marching confidently toward greatness. It was fighting to preserve what remained. These were the years in which his personality hardened, proud, exacting, skeptical of incompetence, impatient with empty rhetoric. He was drawn toward circles critical of Abdülhamid II's old style of rule, and like many officers of his generation, he came of age amid ferment, conspiracies, and arguments over how an empire in decline could still be salvaged. Yet unlike men who romanticized reform without grasping power, Mustafa Kemal was being trained to command within the actual machinery of a failing state. That distinction matters. He did not approach national crisis as an abstract thinker first. He approached it as an officer. War and command were not metaphors to him. They were daily realities. He served in different parts of the empire, including Libya and the Balkans, and with each campaign, the same lesson deepened. The Ottoman state could not simply continue as it was. By the time World War I arrived, he was already a man shaped by repeated proof that survival required more than loyalty. It required competence under pressure. Then came Gallipoli, the campaign that changed his public stature forever. In 1915, as Allied forces attempted to force the Dardanelles and open a path to Istanbul, Mustafa Kemal played a decisive role in the Ottoman defense. His leadership there helped stop the advance and turned him into a national hero. Gallipoli did not merely give him fame. It gave him legitimacy deeper than rank. He had shown that when the empire was threatened at its core, he could act faster and more decisively than others around him. But even that triumph carried a darker truth. He had helped save the Ottoman capital in war, yet the empire itself was still moving toward collapse. That contradiction is the bridge to the next stage of his life. Before he became the founder of modern Turkey, he became something even more dangerous to the old order, a victorious officer with proof that he could save a nation better than the imperial system that claimed to rule it. World War I ended not in Ottoman recovery, but in defeat, occupation, and humiliation. The empire that had staggered through decades of decline was now being carved by the victorious powers, while the Sultan's government seemed too weak or compromised to resist effectively. For Mustafa Kemal, this was the decisive break. Saving the old order no longer looked realistic. The question was whether anything independent could still be rescued from the wreckage. In 1919, he was sent to Samsun, officially as an inspector charged with restoring order, but that mission became the opening move of something far larger. From Samsun, he began organizing nationalist resistance, treating Allied occupation and imperial collapse not as final verdicts, but as the starting point for a new political center outside Istanbul. He moved through Amasya, Erzurum, and Sivas, helping shape the program that would become the National Pact and gradually building a rival source of authority around the nationalist movement. This was the true making of Atatürk, because it was here that Mustafa Kemal stopped being merely an outstanding Ottoman officer and became the architect of a new national legitimacy. The shift was profound. He was no longer fighting for imperial survival. He was fighting for a sovereign Turkish future that required breaking with the imperial government itself. The decision to establish Ankara as the seat of the provisional nationalist government was not just practical, it was symbolic. Istanbul was the old center, compromised by occupation and tied to the Sultan. Ankara was inland, safer, and free enough to become the heart of a new claim to power. From there, Mustafa Kemal led the War of Independence against occupying Greek forces and other external pressures, while also confronting internal resistance from those still attached to the old order. Britannica's account makes clear that he emerged from this struggle not simply as a commander, but as the undisputed leader of the nationalist cause. Victory in the war did more than save territory. It gave him the authority to decide what political form victory would take. And that is where his greatness becomes inseparable from his ruthlessness. He was not trying to restore the Ottoman state under better management. He was using military success to close the imperial chapter altogether. The Sultanate was abolished in 1922. The Republic would follow in 1923. This sequence matters because it shows the logic of his rise. War first created the authority to act, and then authority was used to redefine the nation itself. Before the world knew him as Atatürk, he was the soldier who looked at imperial collapse and refused to treat it as an ending. He treated it as clearance for a harder beginning. The Republic proclaimed in 1923 was not simply a new flag over an old political culture. Mustafa Kemal, now its first president, intended something far more radical. He had used war to rescue Turkish sovereignty, but he did not believe sovereignty alone was enough. In his view, the society itself had to be remade if the new state was to survive in the modern world. That is why the next stage of his life is so important. Many military victors preserve what they inherit. Mustafa Kemal set out to transform it. He pushed a program of secularization and Western-oriented modernization that struck at the foundations of Ottoman political and social order. The caliphate was abolished. Religious schools and institutions lost their old central role. The legal and educational systems were overhauled. The Arabic script, which had shaped Ottoman Turkish for centuries, was replaced by the Latin alphabet in 1928, one of the most dramatic cultural reforms of the new republic. Surnames were adopted, European-style dress was promoted, and public life was recast to align with the model of a modern nation-state rather than an Islamic empire. These were not cosmetic changes. They were an assault on inherited structure. Britannica describes them as revolutionary in scale, and that word matters. Mustafa Kemal was not merely governing Turkey, he was forcing Turkey through a redefinition of itself. This is where the grandeur and the severity of his rule become inseparable. He believed the country could not afford gradualism. Too much had already been lost. Too much weakness had already been exposed. In his mind, delay was dangerous. So reform came from above, driven by a state that expected obedience because it considered transformation a matter of national survival. That is why his legacy has such weight. He did not simply build a republic, he built a republic with a doctrine. Kemalism, later summarized in the principles of republicanism, nationalism, populism, statism, secularism, and revolution, offered not just policy, but a national direction. Yet even as he modernized the country, he governed in a highly centralized way. Opposition was limited, dissent constrained, and the authority won in war flowed directly into the authority exercised in peace. This tension is essential to his story. Mustafa Kemal used the moral force of national rescue to justify a top-down remaking of society. For admirers, that saved Turkey from fragmentation and backwardness. For critics, it also narrowed the political space in which alternative futures might have developed. But whatever judgment one makes, the scale of his achievement remains extraordinary. The officer who had watched an empire die now stood at the head of a new republic, using the legitimacy of war to reorder language, law, education, public identity, and the very imagination of the nation. By the time Mustafa Kemal received the surname Atatürk in 1934, the transformation he had driven was already so extensive that the new name felt less like a title than an official summary of his role. He was no longer just the victorious general of Gallipoli or the nationalist leader of Ankara. He had become the symbolic father of a state built from imperial ruin. Yet the full power of his story lies in how unlikely that outcome once seemed. He had started as a boy in Salonika, in an empire others assumed would continue to decline until it vanished. He became a military student because the army was one of the few serious pathways open to ambition in a troubled state. He learned command in an order already losing faith in itself. He won fame defending the old imperial capital, then turned against the imperial structure when he judged it beyond rescue. He used war to create authority, and authority to make reform irreversible. That is the complete arc. Before Ataturk became the national founder remembered in statues and schoolbooks, he was a man repeatedly forced to choose between loyalty to inherited forms and loyalty to survival. Again and again, he chose survival, but on his own terms. That is what made him so consequential. He was not satisfied with preserving remnants. He wanted to decide what the future would look like. When he died in 1938 in Istanbul, he left behind a country profoundly changed from the one into which he had been born. The legal system was different. The alphabet was different. The educational structure was different. The relation between religion and state was different. Even the national self-understanding was different. Turkey was no longer an Ottoman remnant pretending continuity. It was a republic taught to imagine itself as modern, secular, and distinct. Yet the price of such speed and concentration of change must also remain part of the picture. Ataturk's model depended heavily on centralized authority, elite direction, and the belief that society could be pushed into renewal from above. That worked in many ways, but it also meant that his founding legacy was tied to a powerful state tradition that would shape Turkish politics long after his death. The final tension in his life, then, is the one that gives it its cinematic force. He was both liberator and imposer, savior and disciplinarian, the man who freed a nation from imperial collapse and then demanded that nation accept a new identity at revolutionary speed. That is why he remains so magnetic as a before fame subject. He did not merely climb to power. He grew inside catastrophe until catastrophe became the raw material of nation building. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was made by the death of an empire, and then he used that death to author one of the most sweeping state transformations of the modern era,